Hello there, my name is Sixo, but more on that later, as now it's time to get some guts. And by that I am of course referring to the rather spectacular package, which is the latest offering from third-party company Fanshobby, and sees them overhauling their Powerbaser and God Armor designs in a new, distinctly orange flavour. After all, you know when you've been tangoed. Now before we begin, I should mention that today's review is brought to you by TF Source, so I'll throw a link to their site in the video description below. I'd also be very grateful if you could leave me a like for this video and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Also in the description is a link to my Patreon, where in exchange for your support you can get access to a ton of perks, including exclusive galleries and early access to videos such as this. Finally, there's a link to my Redbubble store, where you can pick up a huge range of different designs, including loads of my photos across all kinds of different merch. I'm uploading new ideas all the time, so be sure to check it out and treat yourself. All that said, let's get to looking at today's toys, shall we? And I'm sure there may still be some people who are wondering just what the inspiration for this repainted release really is. Well, it's a take on the 2002 reissue of the Generation 1 Master Force God Jinrai toy, which itself was originally released in the West under the more familiar name of Power Master Optimus Prime in 1988. However, the Takara version had a few more bells and whistles to it, not least of which was the addition of the God Bomber armor that is also recreated by Fanshobby here. As for the color scheme, this has precedent in the accompanying 1980s Master Force cartoon, where Jinrai is actually a human protagonist bonded to a lifeless robot that resembles the original Convoy design. Come the end of the show, Jinrai must face off against a powered-up hybrid of Black Zarak and an entity known as Devil Z, so combines his own power with that of the Headmaster Juniors to initiate his mighty Fire Guts attack, during which he glows orange, as anybody does when they're out to win the day, no? The original Fire Guts God Jinrai toy is a personal favourite of mine, as I may have already mentioned in another video, plug. So needless to say, I've been tremendously excited about seeing what Fanshobby have cooked up with their version. And for starters, the packaging does not disappoint, as it's both rather stunning in its own right, but also does an incredible job at paying homage to the box of the original 2002 toy. Whoever designed this was clearly penning a real love letter to that vintage release, all the way down to the style of the Fanshobby logo and many of the smaller details on offer. That's to say nothing of the attractive back of the box offering, which itself is also a fairly flawless recreation of the original equivalent, even down to the placement of the battle scene and the little pointy boxes with the various features on offer. Stellar stuff. Now look, I could talk about this box all day, but at some point we're going to have to get it open, although fortunately the contents look even more exciting. The toy comes presented in a sizable and very heavy clamshell, as for the first time in the many releases of this mould, Fanshobby have included both the Powerbaser and God Armor figures in one package. There are also tons of accessories, including a large set of guns which can also be split apart for use in the smaller robot mode, a set of very orange dual cannons which remain a signature part of this robot design, a pair of fold-out swords for the God Armor component, along with that robot's massive shoulder cannon weapon, and a very chunky pair of missiles for it too. Then you get the main mini Jinrai figure himself, which transforms into the vehicle mode engine, along with the 3 orange junior headmasters, which Fanshobby have packaged with each God Armor release before this, as well as an additional spare head for the combined mode, an alternate head for the original Powerbaser toy, and no less than 3 sets of swap out options for the eyes for this toy too. Finally, there are a pair of character cards for both robots, and 2 sets of instructions as well, making this quite a comprehensive package on the whole. The fact that Fanshobby saw fit to release this as one complete package is appreciated, although there's so much going on here that it's almost a bit overwhelming knowing where to begin. Starting off going smallest to biggest, we first have the little Jinrai engine figure himself, who here looks rather magnificent with his new orange colour scheme, and as with previous versions, features a decent amount of detail and even a couple of tiny paint applications to really seal the deal. He's also surprisingly articulated for such a tiny thing, giving him a tremendous amount of play value on the whole. Of course, he can also take his rightful place in the engine block on the front of the main vehicle cab, or alternatively can be tabbed onto the front of the trailer section as well, which is something I'd somehow missed on all the previous versions of this toy that I've owned before. Next we have the 3 heads of the junior headmasters, which are of course repainted versions of those seen on the main toys Fanshobby are putting out to represent those characters, with Athena and Ace Hitter already out and the final release, Cap, still on the way. The heads are included here just as they have been with every previous Fanshobby God Armor release. As in the cartoon, the children are regularly seen riding inside God Bomber's vehicle mode for transport, and of course form an integral part of the Fire Guts God Jinrai power-up that inspired this whole release. The toys themselves look fab and can be quickly transformed to their humanoid modes where, like Jinrai, they possess a fair dose of articulation and play value. They're also quite nicely detailed and to my mind form a really welcome welcome bonus inclusion to this release on the whole. Just like in the cartoon, they can be stowed away inside the God Armor unit here by opening up the front cockpit panel and placing each of them inside. There's even room for their little parts forming helmet sections, showing that Fans Hobby have a clear eye for detail. And I think they look simply marvellous when all in position and ready to go. What's especially neat is that when you fold down the front section of God Armor again, you can see the 3 minifigures poking their faces out through the corresponding windows. Another very neat touch in the design. Anyway, with the little peeps all in place, let's have a gander at those vehicle modes, starting with the cab section, which looks exceptionally good with its new popping colour scheme. Not to mention the gorgeous gold chrome on areas such as the bumper and the front grille, along with some nicely applied silver trim paint applications around the window edges and a rather stunning shiny orange moulded finish to the windows themselves. Then you have little touches such as chrome smokestacks and wheel rims, along with rubber tyres and a generally top-notch finish on the whole. It's definitely a very chunky and stylised take on the classic Jinrai cab design, a theme which continues throughout this release, but I think that it works. It's a similar story with the trailer section, which wears that magnificent orange colour with unadulterated pride, alongside some very attractive silver and red highlights to boot. It's a bit of a shame that the trailer can't stand on its own, but once you plug it into the cab using the hitch attachment, it all starts to take shape. After which you're going to want to install the dual cannons on the sides and the black handguns atop the back to complete the overall look. And it's got to be said that despite this being my 6th version of this design in hand, I'm still very captivated by how good it looks in this vehicle form, with that orange colour scheme perhaps even being my favourite rendition of it so far. It looks fabulous. That said, it's not entirely perfect, with a couple of areas on my copy not tabbing together perhaps quite as flush as I might like, and despite its great looks, it's arguably missing little touches such as an opening door on the rear of the trailer, but on the whole this remains a captivating overall design from Fans Hobby, and one that I'm very excited to finally see decked out in Fireguts Orange, as it does such a wonderful job at capturing the charm of the vintage original in that regard. Moving on to the God Armor vehicle mode, it's a similar story all round, as they've done a brilliant job at recreating the bizarre but idiosyncratic look of this form from the cartoon, and of course the quirky 2002 toy as well, especially as so much of the main colour on offer is red. I'm also a big fan of the gold front section, although I did note that the paint wasn't wholly evenly applied in some of the smaller nooks and crannies. Still, this thing looks spectacular on the whole and features a ton of striking paint applications to really help it stand out. It's certainly a treat for the eyes. Another small grumble of mine is that some of the tabs on the side panels seem to have trouble holding together as firmly as I'd like, which in turn means that the main body of this vehicle mode can feel like it's lacking a bit of solidity at times. Naturally, you're going to want to complete the look with that massive missile launcher taking pride of place atop the vehicle, after which you can go ahead and install one of the 2 missiles on offer with a satisfying click. These things fire across the room with an almighty wallop, but should you be worried about losing an eye, then Fans Hobby have already included a nifty safety feature, whereby you can press a second button to prevent you from accidentally setting off the trigger mechanism. Neat touch. Then you have a handy spot of weapon storage for the 2 swords, which can be pegged securely on the underneath of the God Armor vehicle mode. What really strikes me here is how much Fans Hobby have evolved their design to incorporate these little touches over the years, something that you can see even between the Power Baser and God Armor parts of this release. Although that's not to say that the overall package here doesn't work as a whole, of course. In fact, it's quite the opposite, as once you've got it all hooked up, the combined 3-piece vehicle mode is one of the most awe-inspiring sights in recent third-party memory, especially now that it has that exceptional vivid orange colour scheme. So, a good start so far, but there's plenty more to say on this release, so let's go ahead with the first transformation. Well, that's first transformation done, and on the whole I think that part of it is pretty smooth, with the cab to smaller robot component of it being really no big deal for anyone who's used to third-party Masterpiece style stuff already. If there's any frustration to be had, it's in getting the legs into place for the base mode, as whilst it's not the most elaborate of motions to go through, it's more a question of wrestling the heavily ratcheted hip joints into the right place, especially when it's not always entirely obvious where exactly they're meant to go. That's especially true as various panels on the base mode don't tab into anything, leaving the whole thing feeling a touch unfinished and a bit fan-modey if anything. Still, it all leaves you with a sizable and impressive looking result, even if it is a heavily stylized interpretation of Jinrai's appearance from the cartoon, and indeed the Generation 1 toy and its equivalent base mode configuration. The smaller robot mode itself is a beefy, chunky brute of a thing, with exaggerated proportions and signature flourishes that mean it may not be entirely cartoon accurate, but it is a lovely thing to behold all the same. Again, it's a figure that I'm very familiar with already, but the updated paint scheme and colour palette do wonders for it, with the combo of red, orange and blue being very striking up close. I really like the head sculpt on this toy, and especially now with those bright orange highlight stripes, solid baby blue eyes and sparkly silver finish. The sculpted robotic detail on the chest windows has always been attractive on this design, but here the shiny blue works wonders against the main electric orange of the body, making for a very eye-catching ensemble overall. That's to say nothing of the various paint applications and tampos found all over the rest of the body, all of which add to the vibrancy and strong visual presentation of this figure. Of course, one thing that might surprise some is to see a fake cab front on the robot mode chest, with the actual windows and grille now on his back, although this is entirely accurate to both the vintage toy and the cartoon. Articulation wise, there's quite a bit to comment on here too, with a fantastic range of motion present throughout the upper body, including some double hinges and some very strong clicky ratchet joints where needed. The waist section is a bit of an oddity mind, as although it allows for a lot of free movement, including an ab crunch, it really doesn't feel the most solid, and if anything it kind of looks like you've missed something in the transformation somehow. I do also find those tiny hip skirts a bit irritating, but once you have them out of the way, there's no denying the range that you can achieve with the hip joints, nor indeed with the rest of the legs whilst you're at it. All told, he's a very lithe and limber bot that can pull off a wide array of interesting poses, especially as all of the joints feel up to the task too. You can also equip him with the two smaller hand rifles, which slot incredibly securely into the palm using a rather unique slider mechanism at the back of the hand, although I'm less keen on how the fingers never quite look like they've closed as much as they should, but hey ho. Overall, I'd say this smaller robot mode retains its quirks, but it's still tons of fun on the whole and looks nothing shy of spectacular with this new colour scheme. Turning our attention to the base mode, I can even admit that I'm more enamoured with it now than I remember being the last time I gave it a go, when I first got the original Power Baser figure some years back. And taking into account that I'm never normally a major fan of these types of solutions, I actually think that Fans Hobby have done a pretty neat job of it, all things considered. I mean look, it will always be a giant robot squatting down in many ways, and in this case the obvious presence of the combined mode head in the canopy to the rear doesn't really aid the suspension of disbelief. Yet I really like how all the various cannons clip into the ports on the arms and the legs, and especially the solution for the black handgun barrels tabbing into the trailer hitch at the front, which I think is pretty clever. Again, I do wish that the result was a bit more solid, as if those panels on the side just had some way of tabbing into the main body, it would all feel a lot more purposeful and cohesive somehow. But even taking points like that into account, I find myself giving Fans Hobby the benefit of the doubt here if anything, especially as this is hardly the main focus of this entire release overall. As part of the total package then, there's a fair bit of fun to be had here. But of course it's time to move on again and check out the next transformation as we head towards that large robot mode. Second transformation done, and that's probably the most tricky part out of the way in many regards. As although I didn't struggle with it on this occasion, getting that combined Powerbaser robot together can be a bit of an undertaking if you don't get everything in just the right place. The main trick is in making sure that the cab unit is properly transformed, and that the waist and legs are correctly positioned, as otherwise you'll have major drama when it comes time to tab everything in later on. That said, this orange version did feel a little smoother than previous copies I've owned of this design, and so on the whole I have to say I rather enjoyed it on this occasion. Then you have the God Armor conversion, which by its very nature relies heavily on parts forming, although I would hope that even the most cynical of collectors wouldn't begrudge that solution being employed here, as it's sort of par for the course with God Bomber toys anyway. And besides, I challenge anyone to undertake that transformation and not find it to be bloody clever, leaving a surprisingly cohesive robot mode in its wake. In fact, the only bit that gave me any kind of pause here was unclipping the side panels of the God Armor truck, which is a step I've dreaded ever since the first version I've owned because of how thin those sections are. I did note a small stress mark on my copy already, so it's definitely the bit to watch out for when going through the motions. With the process done, you're left with this pair of chunky monkeys adorning your eyeline, and no doubt the first thing on your mind will be the incredible size of the whole affair. Powerbaser alone is a serious prospect, but seeing the both of them together, wow. They're also very striking in their new colour schemes, with God Armor looking very swish in his burnt red hues versus Powerbaser's more eye-searing block orange. It's a lot to look at, but boy, is it worth it. As before, the proportions on Powerbaser are extremely stylized, and the aesthetic in general is not what you'd necessarily describe as wholly screen accurate, but there's no doubt he looks pretty striking all the same. Probably the biggest aspect of this design that people will quibble is the backpack, which is very sizable and does feature a fairly obvious pair of feet sticking out behind the back of the head, so that's something to get used to. It's certainly a very fresh take versus the G1 toy, although still manages to evoke the same chunky appeal in its way. The head sculpt is really something for starters, with lots of hard lines and sharp angles, and once again the paint on it really seals the deal. This toy does have a light up eye gimmick activated by a small switch on the back of the head, although sadly I don't have the CR927 battery required to make it happen. Should you prefer, then you can split the head open and very easily replace them with any of the three alternatives, including a set of opaque chrome blue eyes more reminiscent of the original version of this mold, a set of opaque gold eyes for a bit of a different look, or a set of translucent orange eyes that can be used for the light up gimmick too. Options. Otherwise, the main gimmick on offer here is the weaponry, with those shoulder cannons looking mighty imposing for one thing. Then you have the hand blasters, which can be recombined and slotted into the palms in the same manner as the smaller robot form. He looks nothing shy of badass with them in place. As far as articulation goes, there's quite a lot happening in the upper body, which again has double hinge joints and some exceptionally strong ratchets going on, making Powerbaser feel very sturdy overall. The waist swivel is a bit of an odd one for how the hip skirts sit either side of the crotch, meaning that you have to move them up and out of the way for posing. It's a strange choice and one that I'm not entirely on board with, but it's not the end of the world, I suppose. Considering the size and weight of this thing, the legs are also surprisingly articulated and can be used to great effect to crank out some wonderful poses. In fact, he's remarkably poseable on the whole, much more so than you might first imagine for such a chunky bot, whilst the strong joints make this a real fun experience overall. Turning our attention to God Armor, it's hard not to think he looks simply marvellous with the various shades of colour going on all over his body, and in particular I really like the chest area with that multi-tone red and nicely decked out mechanical detail, although the paint applications elsewhere look really on point too. And as with Powerbaser, there's a strong head sculpt on offer here, with a very attractive set of shiny gold eyes and a quite particular pout. Again, it's a bit stylized, but I think it works. Arguably, this guy feels more in step with his G1 equivalent somehow, coming off as somewhat less stylized on the whole, despite still being a bit of a departure in many regards. What also impresses me about God Armor is how well he hangs together, considering the nature of how he's built from separate parts. A lot of the bulk is in the upper body, meaning that the legs do feel a touch hollow by comparison, but he's still very solid and stable on the whole. As with previous versions, I did find that some of the panels on his legs also don't clip in as well as I would like, but you stop noticing it after a while, to be honest. He retains that signature massive missile launcher on his shoulder, although it can also be used to fit into the palm of his hands as well, using the same slider solution as Powerbaser. Coupled with the blasters on his forearms, it makes this chap look particularly menacing, to say the least. Should you prefer, then he also has his swords, which sit on the sides of his hips, although I do wish that they held in place a bit more stably than they do. To use the swords, you would first need to slide the blades out of place, although unfortunately in my case I haven't been able to achieve that yet. They were completely stuck to start with, and although I have since managed to slide out the first part of the mechanism with some effort, I now cannot get the top part of the blade to fold out for love nor money. Very strange, as it's not something I've struggled struggled with on previous versions of this toy. Still, once you've folded out the hilt sections, you can slide the swords into his palms, leaving me to ponder a solution for how I'm going to get the tips out for another day. It's a shame I'm struggling to get the full length with these weapons, but still the visual effect is pretty good all the same. God armor is also very well articulated on the whole, though with a couple of quirks. Whilst the upper body is generally good, I'm not a major fan of the fold-up panels on the shoulders for one thing, and the waist swivel is slightly impeded by the bottom of the orange wing sections on either side of the body. Again, the hip skirts are a bit of a strange one too, although at least the general posability on offer is nothing to sniff about here, and generally speaking the joints all feel relatively solid too. It means that whilst God armor isn't quite as dynamic as his buddy Powerbaser, there's still a lot of fun to be had with cranking these two into some poses for display. That's if you have the room for them, as the sheer size of these two means that they might threaten to dominate your collection if you're not too careful. Just lining them up next to any number of other Masterpiece style toys will show you what I mean, as they easily outstrip most of the competition in terms of sheer presence, especially as the two of them together makes for an incredibly beefy sight. It's also fun to see them versus previous versions of these molds, of course, with the striking new orange colour scheme being a very welcome change of pace versus what we've had before. I've already said it and I'll say it again, but this might be my favourite one so far. We're not done yet though, as there's one more transformation to go. It's time to get these two combined up into the rather godly Super Mode. Well, that's the final transformation done, and let me tell you that there are few moments in Transformers collecting quite like this, as the mere in-hand presence of this thing when you first clap eyes on it is positively breathtaking. And again, this may not be my first trip on this particular merry-go-round, yet there's still something so fresh and appealing about that hot orange colour scheme that it's like rediscovering a forgotten pleasure all over again. This is everything I wanted it to be, and then some. In terms of the process to get there, most of the transformation lies with God Armor, of course, as it's mainly a case of separating all of his various components and then reattaching them onto Powerbaser. The end result is ridiculously sizable in just about every dimension, with the height, width and depth on offer pretty much unparalleled by the vast majority of bots you're likely to have in your collection. However, whilst it would be all too easy to bang on about the sheer size of it ad nauseum, there's a lot more to be said about the final configuration of this package, as visually I think it's one of the most interesting third-party toys I've seen in years too. Now again, it's a very stylized take on the powered-up God Jinrai form from the cartoon, and for that matter, the Generation 1 toy's own equivalent Super Mode 2, as the proportions on offer here are heavily exaggerated for one thing. That's mainly true in the chest, where the bulky cab front from God Armor sticks out in front of the head to the point where you'd think that this guy was designed by Rob Liefeld. And there's also considerably more bulk in the backpack area than is typically seen on any other version of this design, yet somehow it all works, and whilst they may have sacrificed some slavish accuracy to sources gone by, Fans Hobby have branched out to create a real visual treat here, and no mistake. In terms of handling though, it definitely loses a little bit of the stability found in the main Powerbaser bot mode, mostly on account of the extreme amount of bulk and heft that it has to cope with. Probably the biggest bit of give here is in the wings, which clip on solidly enough to the backpack, yet can still come untabbed out of position if you're not a bit careful. Whilst the articulation is mostly carried over from Powerbaser, you will find that some of the more extreme poses are just not possible, as you'd simply be asking too much of the legs in terms of supporting the upper body. But frankly, the whole thing looks so good even in a stoic pose that I'm really not grumbling. Besides, it all hangs hangs together relatively well on the whole, and will certainly cope with standing somewhere looking suitably awesome on a shelf. Gimmicks wise, there's nothing particularly unique to this mode, but it does make excellent use of everything that has come before, such as the pride of place mounted missile launcher and the twin handguns now adorning his shoulders as a pair of rather imposing cannons. You can even break out God Armor's dual swords, although again I'm still unable to extend mine to the full length required for the final form of this Bemoeth bot. When not using the swords, there's even the option to stow them away on the backpack section, which is just another neat touch that shows Fans Hobby's incredible eye for detail with these matters. I also really dig the additional super mode head that's included with this release, as whilst it's entirely optional versus the regular power base and noggin, you've got to love those extended out antennae sections. However, I think my favourite gimmick here remains the 3 Headmaster Juniors, now securely tucked away in the combined mode chest in much the same manner seen in the Master Force cartoon when God Shinrai is ready to get his fire guts on. It's just another element of this entire design that works so brilliantly. Really though, the most commented on aspect of this mode is surely always going to be the size of it, and it's no surprise that when you start stacking it up against any number of other toys from your collection, you quickly realise how outmatched most of them are going to be. Probably the best accompaniment for it overall is naturally Fans Hobby's own Double Evil, although I'm sure there will be some fun to be had with facing it off against the upcoming Generation Selects Black Zarek very soon too. Really then, as the culmination of an entire package, there's a lot to love about the combined mode, just as there's little doubt that Fans Hobby have turned it out with this release on the whole. It's not without its quirks along the way, but all told there's absolutely tons of fun included in this box, to say nothing of just how incredible it is that anyone saw fit to make a masterpiece styled Fire Guts God Shinrai at all. It's an absolutely wholehearted toot. Now, as already mentioned, you'll find a link to TF Source's site in the video description below, so do check them out for all your Transformers and third-party needs. There are also links to both my Patreon and my Redbubble store, so be sure to take a look at those if you want to support me in exchange for some awesome perks and merch. Finally, I'd love it if you could drop me a like for today's video, please, and don't forget to let me know your thoughts on this toy. Do you like what you see, or not so sure? Otherwise, that's it from me, so thanks for watching and have a great rest of your day. TTFN.